Rico. And what a lot of people don't realize is that Banesco USA, which is our legal charter, we're part of we're a privately owned bank, a global bank, with offices. We have a $93 billion bank in Spain and Portugal. We have a bank in Panama. We have a bank in Dominican Republic, a bank in Venezuela. Right there, there's all of our flags up there. And we are the U.S. component of the group. And you'll see that there's a flag on the island of Puerto Rico, because we operate a full-service bank on the island. There's 3 big Puerto Rican banks, and Banesco are the 4 banks that are active. And what we do in Puerto Rico, which I'm very proud of, is we have a real niche. It's a corporate bank. All we do is commercial clients, real estate, construction, and operating companies. And we are not the biggest, but I would say that humbly we are the best in terms of agility, certainty of close, and the bank in Puerto Rico is growing very quickly. Introduction, right? I think everybody knows Rodrick and everybody knows Adam. And it's nice, the 3 of us have a real passion for the island, and we want to see it grow and we want to see it develop. So looking forward to this conversation, and again, on behalf of all of us from Banesco, welcome. Nice to have you.
So thanks to Callie and the team here at Banesco for agreeing to host this conversation. So when I took the job in Puerto Rico in March of 2019, I got a call like less than a month later from a guy, and I was like, who is this guy? He was like, you need to know me. That's kind of what he said. He said, you need to know me. I've been doing business in Puerto Rico for over 20 years. I'm excited about where Puerto Rico is going, and I can help you. That guy, of course, is Adam Greenfield. And what I found over the last 3 or 4 years is that he's been a consistent advocate and supporter of Puerto Rico. So when he told me he was writing this book, I got really excited about it. And I'm not going to steal too much of the thunder, but Adam, could you tell us a little bit about why you decided to write this book and what's it really all about?
Thanks, Rod, and thank you, Calixto, and thanks for all of you guys being here. It really is it's a journey whenever you decide to put something on the line and write a book. And I know my cousin Michael just released his own book recently, and it's been a great experience. And I think that when we look at why you do something, it's hopefully for the right reasons. In my case, it really was to help the island of Puerto Rico. I lived for Puerto Rico for 25 years. I married a Boricua. My kids were born and raised in Puerto Rico, and I have 22 family members that are still in Puerto Rico, as well as some businesses. So I'm very committed to the island. And like most people, during the last 15 years of economic crisis, it was really tough to make a living on the island, and I ended up moving to Miami, like about 600,000 people. And I really thought that was it. I thought Puerto Rico would be a chapter in my life, and I would close it and kind of move back to Miami and be kind of U.S. based. And then 2017 happened, the hurricanes. And as we all know, Puerto Rico got slammed with 2 Category 5 hurricanes. And really at that point in time, it was all hands on deck. It was really about helping people survive and trying to get people off the island. And so we spent many months with resiliency and rescue work. And then it became energy. Let's get the lights back on for people. So I ended up finding myself connecting all these energy companies to come back to Puerto Rico. But really what changed and was kind of the deciding factor for me to write the book was Surfside. And a lot of you know that Surfside was a building that fell down here in Florida, and there were about 90 plus people that died in the building, of which many people in that building were Puerto Ricans, and we had 5 of our family members that didn't make it. So when Surfside happened, being the developer that I am, really I started to ask a lot of tough questions about resiliency, sustainability, climate change, and kind of what to do about it. And that kind of began the whole process of looking at Puerto Rico and saying, how do we make sure that this doesn't happen again in Florida, but also how do we make sure that Puerto Rico stays strong, not just for this year, next year, but for years to come.
That's great, that's great. I mean, Puerto Rico, when you say Puerto Rico, the things that come to people's mind are hurricanes, bankruptcy, a power utility that doesn't seem to work. What's the real status of things on the ground in Puerto Rico today, both in terms of the economy as well as quality of life?
A lot of you might be saying, well, why is Rodrick Miller sitting here, next to me today? And I think that we really all owe this gentleman, as well as all the other people that work and invest Puerto Rico and discover Puerto Rico, for what they've done. Puerto Rico has gone through this major change of just perception, right? It was always, is that Costa Rica? And then suddenly, after the hurricanes, Puerto Rico got on the map, right? And I think the number was 72% of Americans today realize that Puerto Rico is part of the U.S. That number was under 40% a decade ago. And so really, when we look at where Puerto Rico is today, it's leaps and bounds further than it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, in terms of the perception, in terms of the information flow. And so from my perspective, I'm just very impressed with the efforts that have been done to promote the island, and I think that we're moving in the right direction.
What do you see as the biggest opportunity in Puerto Rico right now?
Historic moment. There is about $80 billion that have been allocated for the island. And I always get asked the question, how much of that's really going to come to the island? And I say, if even just 10% or 15% of that money makes it through the system, that would be historic, right? That would be more money that has ever come to the island of Puerto Rico. So we're expecting at this time to have very strong economic growth. I think for most of us who do run numbers and look at economic statistics, we're expecting a good 5 to 10 years of strong economic growth for the island. So opportunities, I think you're going to see opportunities in sectors like pharmaceuticals. I think you're going to see it in construction. I think you're going to see it in energy. And then certainly you're going to see it in tourism. So a lot of these industries that have been latent or been quiet or even disappearing are going to come back to Puerto Rico.
We've seen prices, both on the commercial and residential, kind of go up dramatically over the last decade, or even less over the last 4 or 5 years. You've got the crystal ball. What's the future of real estate in Puerto Rico look like for the next few years?
So I think that when we look at real estate in and of itself, we have to say, is the foundation of Puerto Rico strong enough to keep the real estate going? And I think that we all suffered dramatically. The COVID pandemic for all of us was really a life-changing experience, right? The world went through this life-changing experience. And then suddenly, next thing you know, it's all about reshoring. It's all about protecting our industries at home. And Puerto Rico is part of the United States, right? Puerto Rico has the ability, everybody has a U.S. passport, it has military clearance. Everybody who works in Puerto Rico has the ability to be able to work in very top secret and very critical industries. So what happens is now manufacturing that looked like it was going to go and disappear forever is coming back strong. And so when you have at least 45% of your economy based on one industry, which is manufacturing, and it's coming back strong, that makes me feel good. That makes me feel very good.
That's great. We know that Puerto Rico doesn't really have a competitive banking infrastructure. We know that we've got kind of really big gaps in terms of access to capital amongst different classes. What are some of the solutions or some of the things that you're seeing that are emerging as it relates to the ability of companies in Puerto Rico to find access to capital, whether it's for scaling companies or whether it's for investment in real estate projects? How is that happening on the island?
So many of you who have been in Puerto Rico for decades remember that there were about 12 to 15 banks in Puerto Rico. When I arrived in 1993, there were Spanish banks, there were Canadian banks, there were U.S. banks, and there were a handful of Puerto Rican banks, right? So we're talking about a lot amount of banking, whether it was mortgage banking or commercial banking, and they all disappeared. When the crisis hit, the Great Recession in 2008, we lost a lot of those banks. And Puerto Rico today has basically 3.5 banks. So from a traditional banking sector, it's not at the same level that it was before. And so when we look at what's going to happen with finance, one thing is to say, okay, well, we need Calixto to come and bring more people and get more involved, and maybe we can get another American bank to come down back to Puerto Rico. And I think that's very possible. I think that now that Puerto Rico has officially left its bankruptcy and it's now entering the capital markets, I think we're going to see more interest, like groups like Visa, who say, okay, this is a place that we can do business in. But I also think there's new opportunities and new financial groups that are coming to Puerto Rico. And you've been involved with a lot, and I wish you could talk a little bit about those secondary kind of fintech groups that are providing new sources of capital and different waves of capital. Actually, and Rodrick, you were involved a lot with that, and with the IFEs and other groups. I mean, tell us a little bit about that.
And what we've seen over the last few years is because of the types of legislation that are in Puerto Rico, more and more of these international financial entities are choosing Puerto Rico as a home. The other thing is because of the aggressive tax policy, we're finding increasingly third-party investors are coming to the island and saying, how can we invest, whether it's in property or whether it's in businesses. One of the things that we did when I was running Invest Puerto Rico is we set up something called Impeller. Impeller was a platform that was created to connect private equity, VC, hedge fund money to projects on the island. When I left Invest Puerto Rico about a year ago, at that time, we had over 25 different private funds that had self-selected to put their information up that we're here, we're looking for projects to invest in Puerto Rico. And we had, hundreds of actually companies that were seeking funding. So a lot of the solutions that we're seeing emerge in Puerto Rico aren't really tied to the traditional structures of how to finance things. Of course.
History of the economics. And say, what can we learn from the history of the economics? So in the book, I started in 1898. And what was fascinating was Puerto Rico has had the first largest municipal bond market in the United States in 1917. Triple tax exempt bonds, these famous bonds where you don't pay state, federal, or local taxes, were invented in Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico, when it was initially designed, was designed as this tax haven. And that was the game plan that was set up in the early 1900s. So imagine, Puerto Rico, for over 100 plus years, has been basing its economy on tax incentives. And so what was really interesting that I learned as I started to follow those tax incentives, as we went through personal tax incentives and corporate tax incentives and pharmaceutical tax incentives, was something came to mind that was pretty obvious, was that tax incentives expire. Tax incentives, they come and they go. And they usually go because of either abuse, or they usually go because of other third parties like other states that say, hey, that's not fair that Puerto Rico has tax incentives. We want them to, or they shouldn't get them. So I saw this constant giving tax incentives to Puerto Rico and having them being taken away. So the first thing that when I looked at the history, I was like, maybe this is an attractive way to bring people and businesses to an economy, but maybe it doesn't provide a long-term stability. And that was my first aha moment in writing this book.
And I'm going to lean into this. I'm trying not to talk too much because this is the stuff that I love, but So Puerto Rico, when I got there in 2019, one of the first things that I do every time I move to a community is I talk to the business leadership and I talk to the political leadership, and I say, what is the value proposition of your market? Why is it that $1 invested here is better than $1 invested everywhere else? And when I asked in Puerto Rico, I won't say 100% of the time, but 95, 96% of the time, the answer was, pues los incentivos, the incentives. And part of, and so the first real conversation I had to have on the island and in terms of running Invest Puerto Rico was that the reason why incentives exist is to offset a competitive disadvantage. So that automatically starts the conversation when you're talking about incentives, that there's something that's out of kilter. Your workforce isn't strong enough. The infrastructure is not quite right. There are other things that make it more expensive to do business there, so you have those incentives to offset it. And I said, no, that's not your value proposition. I kept telling people, they said, what is it? I said, I don't know yet, but that's not it. And then so as we started to work on the island, and what did I find? The number one driver of investment decisions by company, and this is a pivot moment, is talent, right? Smart people. And what we found was, there were 80 plus universities that Puerto Rico had. It's number 6 in the world in terms of STEM professionals, according to the World Economic Forum. Number 1 in terms of pharmaceutical manufacturing. I found all of these great things about the talent and also about the asset base. And that really was the competitive advantage if it can keep the talent, right? And so this incentives conversation is one that Puerto Rico always goes back to because it's what it's always always been. But for the island to move forward, it's going to really have to diversify its value proposition beyond incentives. With that, the talent question. Can you talk a little bit about the landscape of people in Puerto Rico and productivity and how they work?
Yes, so clearly, that it is so much higher than I ever thought. I mean, you just look at some statistics like NASA, right? NASA space rockets, they hire more people from the University of Miami West than anywhere else in the United States, right? More recruits, and those statistics of hiring and STEM research and STEM, it's just incredible. So Puerto Rico has this great labor pool that's already there. So when we talk about the value proposition, I definitely agree. You don't have to lead with the incentives. And in the book, I actually had a chance to interview a Swiss manufacturing gentleman who was in Geneva, and he wanted to move to the United States, and he did a blind test between Switzerland, Texas, and Puerto Rico. And he said, Adam, which do you think built the best product? Right? And I'm like, well, Switzerland, of course. And he looked at me and he says, who did good? But he said Puerto Rico was equal. And then he said, who do you think was cheaper? And I said, Puerto Rico? And he said, yes. And then he went to Puerto Rico, knowing that the quality was equal to the Swiss, knowing that the price was 15 to 20% cheaper than the Swiss, and he saw the tax incentives, and he said, this is a done deal. And that's the process that I think really exemplifies Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico has the talent. Now it's just a question of having groups like yourself, and I don't know if you are aware of it, but Invest Puerto Rico and Discover Puerto Rico are these public-private partnerships that were brought to really just market and bring seamlessness and transparency to Puerto Rico. Because one of the issues that Puerto Rico's had, one of my biggest challenges is getting you guys to come to the island and other investors is information, clarity of information. And in fact, I'm working on a lot of those projects. How do we bring more transparency? In Pillars One program, Henry Keenan, who's in the back with a company called Red Atlas, and he's an entrepreneur.
He's also working with Invest Puerto Rico.
Who's actually come up with a very innovative way to provide more market data for the island. Now that might sound like a small thing, but it's that transparency of information that changes these islands completely, whether it's in Puerto Rico or anywhere else in the Caribbean. So I think that from an island's perspective, we really do need to bring some transparency to the marketplace. We need to be able to just say what we do and communicate it, and I think the rest is going to take care of itself.
Transparency, you talked about that as one of, and I think that's actually a critical pillar in the island's future, being able to conduct business and do transactions. You know, from a real estate perspective, there's not even MLS doesn't exist in Puerto Rico. And unfortunately, now we got Red Atlas providing kind of the types of information and the sites and et cetera, so that there's actually more transparency into what's happening from an information perspective. Give us, what are the other kind of, whether they're values or whether they're tools that you think are essential to kind of the future of Puerto Rico and their economic longevity?
Puerto Rico is used real estate as a basis like everybody else uses real estate. But I think that we need to be able to stand economically, Puerto Rico, on its own 2 feet. And I think real estate taxes is one of the ways that has to do it. The fiscal federal board really believes that this is something, and it's one of the things I mentioned in the book is that's a solution for Puerto Rico.
We have to develop the entrepreneurship right there in Puerto Rico, because there is when we get the multiplying effect in terms of economics.
The good news is that as the economy is getting better, we are starting to see more and more Puerto Ricans come back to the island. In fact, 2022 was the first year of population growth on the island, meaning that more people finally, for the first time in 15 years, started coming to Puerto Rico than leaving. And I expect, based on the history of the island, when I wrote the book, I thought that this was the first time that Puerto Rico had ever lost such a large percentage of its population. But this was part of the economic policy. After World War II, Puerto Rico exported 650,000 people. Literally, the government of Puerto Rico paid people to leave the island because it didn't have enough work, and it was the largest airlift migration in the history of the United States. And that happened 3 times in Puerto Rico's history since the 1890s. So having people come and go is a natural part of the way Puerto Rico has been set up. There's an economic crisis, let's get people out of Puerto Rico, whether it's them leaving volitionally or people paying for it. So I'm very hopeful that as the economy keeps growing, and we expect the economy to keep growing, that we're going to get more people returning to Puerto Rico because of that.
What's your credit rating, and concerns about their ability to fund these with access to the bond markets, with those debt limits coming out of bankruptcy.
So, Puerto Rico's debt, right, has had about $70 billion in debt just before it went into bankruptcy. And when I was looking at and researching that debt, you know, what was remarkable was about 60 billion of that only happened in a very brief period of time, right? So Puerto Rico was running with about 14 to 18 billion dollars of debt right before it went into its own crisis in 2005. So pretty good economy, pretty low debt ratios. What happens? In 2005, Puerto Rico says 936 was just about to expire. It lost all this big pharmaceutical tax credits, didn't want to fire people, didn't want to cut costs. And so instead of cutting costs because of the lack of revenues that it was getting from the tax incentives, it just kept borrowing money. So within a very short period of time, about 7 years, it went from about 15 billion in debt to over $70 billion in debt. That debt, that short period of debt was a direct relationship to not cutting costs and maintaining a bloated government. And so I think when you look at what the fiscal board, which is the board that's regulating Puerto Rico's economy, it has made it very clear that it needs to have a lot of these jobs come to the private sector, right? Puerto Rico cannot continue to run its government with that many people working because it's a big expensive cost. So there is this structure that's in place that's looking for ways to make Puerto Rico more private. I think that's really, we're going to see where that goes. But I'm hopeful that a lot of the new innovations, a lot of the people that are coming in are bringing people to the private sector, and that Puerto Rico is going to be able to balance its budget better than it had in the past.
What parts of Puerto Rico's current infrastructure challenges give you the most concern? And how have you, in the past, addressed those infrastructure challenges in your projects or seen other developers do so?
When you look at risk in Puerto Rico, the electrical grid was definitely at the top of anybody's list, right? Puerto Rico is at 33 cents a kilowatt hour, which is about 3 times more expensive than in the United States, and it's very tough to be competitive as an island. It's very tough to have long-term economic growth when you're paying that much money, pharmaceutical. So the good news is that Puerto Rico, as many of you might know, has recently undergone through some public-private partnerships on the electrical grid. And even though this has started out bumpy and there's been some discourse about the effectiveness of it, that train has left the station. And out of the 80 billion, a significant part of that is to rebuild the electrical grid using redundant energy sources, green energy sources, microgrids. So I think that from a long-term planning perspective, Puerto Rico by 2050 is supposed to be 100% off-grid. I think it's on its way to moving in that direction, but that will probably be the biggest, greatest change that comes out of this period of time, is the privatization of the electrical grid and Puerto Rico being able to use energy sources that before were probably too expensive and now are becoming a regular use. And really, the way that we need to look at Puerto Rico is what's its neighbors look like? How are things in the Caribbean? So the first thing, which from an investor's perspective, is you better have great airlift, right? Puerto Rico has 8 airports, 8 functioning airports today. It's got 3 quote-unquote national airports. So airlift is pretty good, roads are pretty good, telecommunications. My. Telecommunications, the 5G network in Puerto Rico is one of the best networks in the world, right? 5G, smart cities, being able to take data and take that data and make that into money, right, is the new frontier. And then we look at satellite production. Satellites are the next big manufacturing boom. And we all know that if you want to put a satellite as close to the equator because it's cheaper, less fuel, right, you can get up there faster, and you want that satellite production to be somewhere where there aren't a lot of people in case the satellite falls. Well, where do you think that spot is? That is Roosevelt Roads in Puerto Rico. That is the ideal spot in the United States to build satellites. So when you start looking at your infrastructure, I always joke and say you can go to Puerto Rico and you can use your cell phone, your U.S. cell phone. Your ATM, ATH card works. So from an infrastructure perspective, the island is, except for the electrical, the island is in really, really good shape. And as I mentioned, the electrical is moving forward in a very positive direction, right? We've seen public-private partnerships work really well to everything.
all this new looks and all the new ideas for development, how concerned are we about maintaining the environment?
Huge. So we're starting to see beaches erode and disappear. So what would the Caribbean be like without a beach? So in my book, I talk a lot about new solutions, combining technology with sustainability and resiliency. And I think that part of these answers have to come from finding new ways to pay for these improvements that have to be made. Because we can't keep taxing people, and we certainly can't tax people that don't have money. Right? In most of the Caribbean islands, people just don't have the same levels of income. And I'm really concerned about places like Puerto Rico that are on the front lines of climate change. And so in the book, I talk about the use of blockchain technology to be able to generate new revenues, be able to expedite process, cut costs down, especially on the front end.
I think that somewhat in a similar way to Miami having an opportunity, but Puerto Rico for sure, to really attract climate tech. You know, expand manufacturing to all the folks that are focusing on climate tech. The incentives that now have been unlocked through this Inflation Reduction Act, they're just starting to kind of come into the picture. You know, a lot of it's still going to be borne out in the last 12 plus months, but tell me, what are your thoughts around really being able to access some of the significant dollars that have now been unlocked through this act, and what you see in terms of attracting more of those businesses? Because I'll tell you, from what I can tell, a lot of the European countries are saying, with this act, there's so much now an incentive for companies to locate to the U.S. to be able to benefit from it. And I would think you'd have that same benefit with Puerto Rico.
I just hand this mic over to Calixto for a second about the financial sector and how the financial sector is thinking about climate and ESG.
I got to make sure I'm right. What?
The banks in Puerto Rico, really the whole ESG and the pressure around on financial institutions are really at the very, very large global bank levels. It's not come down. And I was actually at a meeting with the regulators last week because I have to say the community banks and small banks are very concerned about what the ramifications are around lending practices for small banks and how limited that could be. And they don't anticipate that it's going to come down, kind of push down into the community bank sector. So I don't think it's really touching the Puerto Rican banks yet, but I think it's a matter of time because if you look at what's happening in Europe, even with our affiliate in Europe, it is much, much more intense, and the requirements and the expectations of the European banks are much greater than what we're seeing in the U.S.
How does Puerto Rico navigate kind of its relationship with the U.S. going forward as it relates to the economy? Is that something that they can do?
The purpose of the book was to be not...
Sorry. That wasn't meant to be a political question.
And it's an important question that no matter where Puerto Rico goes with its relationship with the United States or its continued relationship being a status quo colony or possession, or if that small 4 or 5% minority of independents end up finding a way to get everybody on board with their vision, it really is irrelevant to me. And in the writing of Why Puerto Rico Now, all of the groups in Puerto Rico need a strong, independent economic system, right? Everybody in Puerto Rico and everybody in the United States wants Puerto Rico to be strong, right? A strong state makes a strong nation. A strong colony makes a strong nation. Or even a strong independent country that you're associated with makes a strong nation. So the focus for Puerto Rico needs to be to become independently strong economically, to have the tools to build that infrastructure so we can have new pharma, we can have new innovative companies, we can build new resorts. That's really what this is about, and I think that the time is now. Why Puerto Rico now? Because we've got all the pieces in place. We've had those 15 years of pain that hopefully teach all those 3 different groups that it's better to move forward than to fight amongst themselves. And I think that we're at a moment where we're going to be able to have new opportunities that didn't exist before.
Everybody, let's give Adam a round of applause.